Okay, let's dive right into this. When you hear the word Pharaoh in a biblical context, you probably instantly picture one specific narrative, right? The great stubborn villain of the Exodus story. But the biblical texts actually present a much more complex picture than just that. They reveal a whole succession of very different Egyptian rulers over a span of hundreds of years. So today in this explainer, we're mapping out the full story of the Pharaohs.
Our journey today spans centuries and several completely distinct kings. We'll be looking at Abram's encounter, Joseph's dreamer, the king who forgot, Moses and the stubborn Pharaoh, the Red Sea defeat, and finally, a later alliance. It's really a revolving door of shifting relationships between these biblical figures and the Egyptian throne.
Section 1. Abram's encounter in Egypt. Let's start right at the beginning, setting the stage for how Egypt initially served as a rather bumpy refuge for the patriarch Abram.
So in Genesis 12, a severe famine drives Abram into Egypt. Fearing for his life because his wife Sarai is so beautiful, he actually claims she's his sister. The text tells us the princes of Pharaoh praise her, and she is taken directly into Pharaoh's house. But this triggers immediate divine intervention. God plagues Pharaoh and his house with what the text calls great plagues. Now, the crucial point is how the Pharaoh reacts when he finds out the truth. He doesn't execute Abram. Instead, he firmly orders him to take his wife and leave immediately. But he sends him away incredibly wealthy with cattle, silver, and gold. It's a fantastic paradox. A tense encounter where a man goes in fearing for his life and ultimately leaves enriched rather than destroyed.
Moving on to Section 2, Joseph's dreamer Pharaoh. Fast forward in time and we arrive at the next major era, where we meet a completely new Pharaoh who helps create what we could really call a golden age of co-ruling with a Hebrew named Joseph.
The narrative in Genesis 41 describes a pharaoh who is deeply troubled by two bizarre dreams. First, he dreams of 7 fat cows and plump ears of grain being devoured by 7 lean, ugly cows and blighted ears. None of the Egyptian wise men can figure this out. Enter Joseph, who is brought straight out of a dungeon. Joseph interprets the dreams, explaining that they represent 7 years of great plenty, followed immediately by 7 years of devastating famine. But Joseph doesn't just offer an interpretation, he pitches a brilliant economic strategy to save the region. He suggests taking 1/5 of the harvest during the years of plenty and storing it up in the cities.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how completely this Pharaoh embraces Joseph. Recognizing the spirit of God in him, he elevates this foreigner to unprecedented royal power. Just listen to this promotion straight from the text. Pharaoh takes off his own signet ring and puts it on Joseph's hand, clothes him in fine linen, puts a gold chain around his neck, and has him ride in his second chariot. He essentially hands over the keys to the entire nation, telling Joseph that without his consent, no one shall lift a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Under this Pharaoh, Egypt becomes the ultimate sanctuary, which ultimately saves Joseph's entire family from starvation.
Section 3. The King Who Forgot. Well, history isn't always a straight line of progress, is it? We're now at the massive narrative hinge of our entire explainer, where the relationship between the Egyptian throne and the Hebrews completely fractures.
This single sentence from Exodus chapter 1 changes absolutely everything. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. It's a dramatic pivot. Generations have passed by now, the Israelites have been fruitful and multiplied, and this new king views them objectively not as honored guests anymore, but as a severe military threat to his nation. He's terrified that in the event of a war, this massive population will just join Egypt's enemies.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between these two eras. In the previous era of prosperity under Joseph, he's second in command, they're given the absolute best land of Goshen, abundant food is provided. But the new reality? It's a prison. This new Pharaoh ruthlessly oppresses them, making their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick. And the oppression escalates to a horrific, ruthless degree, culminating in a royal decree ordering that every Hebrew male infant be cast into the Nile River. The sanctuary has quite literally become a place of brutal terror.
Section 4. Moses and the stubborn Pharaoh. This brings us chronologically right into the heart of the showdown we all know. Moses, who actually grew up in Pharaoh's household after being saved from the Nile, returns to Egypt as an adult to demand the Hebrews' release from this oppressive regime. When Moses and Aaron first go to the Pharaoh to deliver God's message to let the people go into the wilderness, the Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5 is completely dismissive. He scoffs at them, saying, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord." This defiant quote really establishes the central conflict of the Exodus narrative. This Pharaoh doesn't just refuse the request, he actively increases their burdens, demanding they now go out and gather their own straw to make bricks.
What follows is a series of escalating divine judgments creating a cascading national disaster. The biblical texts detail plagues that strike at the very heart of the Egyptian state. We're talking a severe disease or murrain wiping out the livestock, to devastating swarms of locusts that eat whatever the previous storms left behind, to a pitch darkness over the land that was so thick it could literally be felt. And finally, the tragic midnight decree resulting in the death of the firstborn in every house in Egypt, from the Pharaoh's throne down to the captive in the dungeon.
Throughout this entire sequence, the texts record a very specific theological detail. It repeatedly states that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or that Pharaoh's heart was stubborn. Just neutrally observing what the source material states here, the texts explicitly say this was done so that God could multiply his signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. It's a fascinating, complex dynamic of divine sovereignty and human defiance that results in total devastation.
Section 5. The Red Sea Defeat. Eventually, of course, that sheer devastation forces Pharaoh to let the people go, but the story doesn't end there. We transition now to the climax of the Exodus narrative, where the Pharaoh suddenly regrets his midnight decree to let them leave. Once the Israelites are wandering out in the wilderness, the Pharaoh's mind changes yet again. He asks his servants, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" And the text is incredibly specific about his military response here. He mobilizes exactly 600 chosen chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, his captains, and his entire army, to chase down the fleeing Israelites.
The texts really frame this as a terrifying trap. This massive Egyptian army overtakes the Israelites while they are encamped by the sea, beside Pi-Hahiroth. The Israelites are completely boxed in, absolutely terrified, crying out to Moses that they are going to die in the wilderness. And of course, this sets up the famous, catastrophic defeat of Pharaoh's forces, where the sea closes right in on the pursuing Egyptian chariots and horsemen, putting a definitive end to that specific era of conflict.
Let's move to Section 6, a later royal alliance. Because if you stop reading at Exodus, you might think the Egyptian throne just remains forever hostile to the biblical figures. But if we jump forward in the texts to 1 Kings, we see how this builds and the relationship unexpectedly resets.
A really surprising sanctuary is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11. A man named Hadad the Edomite is fleeing from his enemies and comes to Egypt. The Pharaoh at that time doesn't enslave him, and he doesn't view him as a threat. Instead, he finds total refuge. The text says Pharaoh gave him a house, appointed him victuals, and granted him land. In fact, Hadad found such great favor that Pharaoh gave him the sister of his own wife, the queen, in marriage. Hadad's son was even raised in Pharaoh's house right alongside Pharaoh's own sons. It's a striking parallel to the earlier Joseph story, proving that the Egyptian throne was not universally hostile in the broader timeline of these ancient texts.
So what does all this mean? We have to ask the crucial question: is the biblical Pharaoh a symbol of incredible sanctuary or devastating peril? As we've seen today, the title really serves as a revolving door of both refuge and ruin. From the wealth given to Abram, to the golden age of Joseph, to the bitter bondage and plagues of the Exodus, and right back to the royal alliances in 1 Kings, the full story of the Pharaohs is rich, it's dynamic, and it's deeply complex. I really hope this explainer has illuminated these shifting relationships for you and honestly leaves you eager to dive into the source texts to read these incredible narratives for yourself. Thanks for exploring this with me today.